The silence had become a living thing in Thomas Whitmore's house, settling into corners like dust and filling rooms with the kind of emptiness that made a man forget what laughter sounded like. 3 years had passed since consumption took Mary and their unborn child, leaving Thomas alone on 800 acres of Colorado high country, where the wind talked more than he did, and the only conversation came from cattle that had learned not to expect answers. At 45, Thomas carried himself with the careful economy of someone who'd learned that wasted motion was just another form of loneliness. His morning routine had become as automatic as breathing. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead, check the stock, mend whatever the previous day's weather had broken, eat meals that tasted like obligation rather than nourishment. The rocking chair on his front porch still creaked with the rhythm Mary had established during their 12 years together, as if her ghost couldn't quite abandon the habit of watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The town of Cedar Ridge lay 15 miles east, close enough for monthly supply runs, but far enough to discourage casual visitors. Thomas preferred it that way. Company required conversation, and conversation inevitably led to questions about plans he didn't have and futures he couldn't imagine. Better to exist in the space between yesterday's grief and tomorrow's uncertainty, measuring time and seasons rather than hopes. He was repairing fence line along the old Indian trail when he first saw her, a figure standing motionless in the shadow of cottonwoods that marked the creek boundary between his land and the reservation beyond. At first, Thomas thought it might be a trick of light and distance, but as he drew closer, the shadow resolved into something that made his weather heart contract with recognition and concern. A young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, wearing a dress that mixed practical frontier cotton with traditional beadwork that spoke of skilled hands and cultural pride. She stood with the kind of stillness that came from people who'd learned that movement could attract the wrong kind of attention, her long black hair braided with strips of leather that had probably been her mother's before they became hers. But it was her face that stopped Thomas in his tracks, that made him understand why she might be standing alone in shadows rather than walking openly through town where people could stare and whisper and turn away. Deep scars marked the left side of her face, running from temple to jaw in patterns that spoke of fire or violence or both. The kind of marks that made children hide behind their mothers' skirts and made grown men uncomfortable with their own capacity for cruelty. "Ma'am," Thomas said quietly, removing his hat as he approached, keeping his voice gentle and his movement slow. "You lost." She turned to face him then, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her eyes, dark brown, almost black, holding depths of intelligence and pain that reminded him why he'd learned to distrust easy judgments about what made people worth knowing. There was strength there, the kind that came from surviving things that would have broken lesser spirits, and a wariness that suggested she'd learned not to expect kindness from strangers. "I am called Ayanna," she said in careful English, her accent giving familiar words a different music that spoke a first language that had no relationship to European tongues. "I seek work, food for work, or shelter for work. I am strong, and I learn quickly." Thomas studied her face, noting not just the scars that others would see first, but the way she held herself with dignity despite circumstances that had obviously brought her to this fence line out of desperation rather than choice. Her hands were calloused from labor. Her posture spoke of someone accustomed to carrying more than her share of any burden, and her eyes held a kind of intelligence that made him wonder what stories she carried and why she'd chosen to share them with a stranger. "What kind of work you looking for?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Single women didn't travel alone through frontier country unless they'd run out of safer options, and scarred native women had even fewer choices than most. "Any work," Ayanna replied simply. "I cook, I clean, I tend animals, I mend things that are broken. I ask only for food and a place to sleep that keeps out rain and cold." Thomas felt something stir in his chest that he thought was buried with Mary. Not desire, exactly, but recognition of another person's fundamental humanity, the kind of awareness that made isolation feel less like protection and more like punishment. "You got family? People who might be looking for you?" Ayanna's expression darkened slightly, shadows moving across her features like clouds across sunlight. "Family is gone. Fire took our lodge. Sickness took my parents, and..." She touched the scars on her face with unconscious gesture. "Other things took what was left." The words carried weight that made Thomas understand he was looking at someone who'd lost everything that mattered and was still finding ways to keep moving forward. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. "Sorrow changes nothing." Ayana replied with the practical wisdom of someone who'd learned that dwelling on loss was a luxury she couldn't afford. Work changes everything. Food, shelter, purpose. These things matter more than pity. Thomas found himself studying her face again, seeing past the scars of the woman beneath. Intelligent, determined, carrying herself with a kind of dignity that couldn't be taken away even when everything else had been stripped from her. "I lost my wife 3 years ago," he heard himself say. "House has been too quiet since then." Something shifted in Ayana's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition of shared loss, the understanding that passed between people who both learned how silence could become a weight too heavy for one person to carry alone. "I am sorry for your loss," she said formally, offering condolence with the courtesy that marked her as someone who'd been raised to understand that grief deserved acknowledgement even from strangers. "Appreciate that," Thomas replied. "Question is, what do we do about two people who both got more empty space than they know how to fill?" Ayana studied his face with the intensity of someone whose survival had depended on reading the intentions of people who held power over her fate. Whatever she saw in his weathered features seemed to satisfy whatever test she was conducting, because some of the tension left her shoulders. "You offer work?" she asked carefully. "I'm thinking I might be offering more than that," Thomas said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "Marriage, maybe? Not the kind with promises neither of us is ready to make, but the kind that gives you legal protection and gives me someone to share the cooking with." The proposal hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that neither had expected when the day began. Ayana absorbed his words with the careful attention of someone calculating risks and benefits in a world where safety was always temporary and usually conditional. "You would marry me?" she asked, her voice carrying surprise that cut straight through whatever emotional defenses Thomas had left. "Despite," she gestured toward her scars. "Because of everything you survived," Thomas corrected gently. "Takes strength to keep going when the world's taken everything from you. That's the kind of strength I'd be honored to have share my name." The wedding took place 3 days later in the parlor of Reverend Matthews, witnessed by his wife and the territorial justice of the peace, who'd driven out from Cedar Ridge more out of curiosity than official duty. Thomas wore his best shirt, the one Mary had insisted he buy for their own wedding 12 years earlier, while Ayana appeared in a dress she'd somehow acquired that transformed her from desperate refugee into someone who belonged in formal ceremonies. The scars were still there, of course. Marriage certificates couldn't erase what fire and violence had written across her skin. But standing beside Thomas in the afternoon light that filtered through the Reverend's lace curtains, Ayana carried herself with a dignity that made the witnesses forget to stare, that reminded everyone present that they were observing something significant rather than merely strange. "Do you, Thomas James Whitmore, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Matthews asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who performed the ceremony hundreds of times, but understood that each iteration held the potential to transform lives in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. "I do," Thomas said firmly, meeting Ayana's eyes as he spoke the words that would bind them together in the eyes of both law and community. "And do you, Ayana?" The Reverend paused, realizing he didn't know her family name. "Son on Water," she supplied quietly, using both her English and Apache names with equal dignity. "Do you take Thomas to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Ayana's pause lasted only seconds, but Thomas felt each heartbeat like thunder in his chest. Then she nodded once, decisive and clear. "I do," she said, and something in her voice suggested the words meant more than mere legal arrangement. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife." Matthews closed his Bible with a sound like a door opening rather than closing. "May God bless this union and guide you both toward happiness." The ride back to Thomas's ranch took 2 hours through country that seemed different now that Ayana was seeing it as home rather than destination. She sat beside him on the wagon seat with careful attention to distance, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid the kind of accidental intimacy that might make either of them uncomfortable with arrangements that were practical rather than passionate. House isn't much, Thomas said as they approached the cluster of buildings that marked his homestead, but it's solid and it stays warm in winter. It looks like a place where people could be happy, Ayanna observed, studying the log cabin with its wide porch and the outbuildings that spoke of prosperity earned through hard work rather than inherited wealth. Was, once, Thomas admitted, might be again, with the right person to help remember what happiness sounds like. He showed her through the house room by room, noting how she examined everything with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read stories in the details of domestic spaces. Her fingers traced the edge of Mary's favorite quilt, still folded on the chair where it had been placed the day she died, and she paused before the daguerreotype on the mantel that showed Thomas and Mary on their wedding day. She was beautiful, Ayanna said without jealousy, just acknowledgement of fact. She was, Thomas agreed, but beauty comes in more forms than most people understand. Takes living a while to figure out which kinds last, and which ones fade when the light changes. That first evening, they established routines that would carry them through the careful period of learning to share space without stepping on each other's emotional boundaries. Ayanna prepared supper with ingredients from Thomas's well-stocked pantry, transforming basic supplies into a meal that carried flavors he hadn't tasted since childhood. Thomas tended to evening chores while she worked, giving her time to establish ownership of kitchen space without feeling observed or judged. You cook like someone who learned from a grandmother, Thomas observed as they shared the evening meal, noting how she managed to make beans and cornbread taste like something special rather than just functional. My grandmother believed that food was medicine for more than just the body, Ayanna replied, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who'd been raised on wisdom passed down through generations. She said that meals prepared with care could heal hearts as well as hunger. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Fire took her too, along with everything else I thought would last forever. Ayanna's voice remained steady, but Thomas caught the slight tightening around her eyes that spoke of grief still fresh enough to cut when touched. But her teachings live in my hands, in the way I understand how to make food taste like home. As darkness settled over the ranch and they prepared for their first night as married strangers sharing the same roof, Thomas showed Ayanna to the small room that had been intended as a nursery, now furnished with a simple bed and dresser that would give her privacy while keeping her close enough to feel safe in unfamiliar surroundings. "Thank you," she said as he lit the oil lamp that would provide light for whatever evening routine she might need. "For the room, for your name, for treating me like someone worth protecting instead of someone be endured." "Thank you," Thomas replied, "for reminding me what it feels like to have someone to protect." That night, as Thomas lay in his bed listening to the soft sound of another person moving through his house, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. The absence of the crushing loneliness that had been his constant companion since Mary's death. Not happiness, not yet, but the possibility of happiness. The sense that his house might remember how to be a home again. In her room, Ayanna sat by the window looking out at stars that seemed brighter here than they had from the reservation, thinking about the strange paths that led people from one kind of life to another. She'd expected to spend whatever remained of her days as an object of pity or disgust, someone whose scars marked her as damaged goods in a world that valued women primarily for their ability to be decorative. Instead, she found herself married to a man who looked at her face and saw strength rather than disfigurement, who'd offered her his name and protection, without demanding anything in return except the opportunity to share the burden of too much empty space. It wasn't love. Neither of them was ready for that kind of vulnerability. But it was something more valuable than love. It was kindness, and a recognition that two broken people might be able to help each other remember what it felt like to be whole. Spring arrived late in the Colorado high country, but when it finally came, it brought with it a transformation that seemed to mirror the gradual changes taking place within the walls of Thomas's ranch house. The snow that had blanketed the land for months gave way to grass that grew green and thick, and the creek that marked the boundary between ranch and reservation ran full with snowmelt that carried the promise of abundance after the lean months of winter. Ayanna had been part of Thomas's household for 6 weeks, and in that time, she transformed the space from a place where one man merely survived into something that deserved the name of home. It wasn't just the obvious changes. Meals that carried flavors beyond simple sustenance, floors that stayed clean without becoming an obsession, windows that let in light because someone remembered to wash them regularly. It was subtler things, The way she'd rearranged furniture to encourage conversation rather than solitude. The small garden she'd planted behind the house where herbs and vegetables grew in neat rows that spoke of knowledge passed down through generations. The way silence had changed from oppressive to comfortable. "You've got a gift with growing things," Thomas observed one morning as they worked side by side in the garden, noting how plants seemed to respond to her touch in ways that went beyond mere horticultural knowledge. "My grandmother said that plants grow best for people who understand that taking care of living things is a way of taking care of yourself." Ayanna replied, her hands moving with sure knowledge as she tended seedlings that would provide food and medicine to the coming seasons. She said that gardens were prayers made visible, requests of the earth to provide what was needed to sustain life. Thomas watched her work, noting not just her competence, but the way gardening seemed to bring out something in her that daily household routines couldn't touch, a kind of peaceful concentration that smoothed the lines of weariness from her face and made her scars seem less like marks of trauma and more like evidence of survival. "What else did your grandmother teach you?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious about the woman who'd raised someone with Ayanna's combination of practical skills and quiet wisdom. That strength comes in many forms, but the strongest form is the kind that bends without breaking. Ayanna glanced up from her work, meeting Thomas's eyes directly. That true beauty has nothing to do with what people see when they first look at you, and everything to do with what they discover when they take the time to really see. The words carried weight that made Thomas understand he was receiving more than casual conversation. This was explanation, perhaps even invitation to understand philosophy that had enabled her to survive losses that would have destroyed someone with less resilience. "She sounds like she understood people as well as plants," Thomas said. "She understood that both needed the right conditions to flourish, and that sometimes those conditions had to be created rather than waited for." Ayanna returned her attention to the seedlings, but Thomas could see the slight smile that played around the corners of her mouth. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said that the best men were the ones who knew how to be strong, without needing to prove it to anyone." Their days had settled into rhythms that felt natural despite their strangeness. Shared meals where conversation flowed more easily than either had expected. Evening hours spent on the porch where they could watch sunset paint the mountains while talking about everything except the careful distance they maintained around the more complex aspects of their arrangement. Thomas found himself looking forward to these conversations, to the way Ayanna's intelligence revealed itself in observations about weather and livestock and the subtle changes that marked the progression of seasons. "You were educated," Thomas said one evening as they discussed the territorial politics that affected everything from cattle prices to the treatment of reservation families. "Not just traditional education, but white man schooling too." "Mission school," Ayanna confirmed, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that marked discussions of subjects that could turn painful without warning. "Before the fire, before everything changed, I learned to read and write and speak English like white children, learned arithmetic and geography and history written by people who'd never seen the places they claimed to know." "What happened to the school?" "Same thing that happened to everything else. Government decided that teaching Apache children to think like white people was less important than making sure they stayed on the reservation where they couldn't cause trouble." Ayanna's voice remained steady, but Thomas caught the anger beneath her calm exterior. Some kind of education make people harder to control, and control matters more than knowledge when you're dealing with people you've decided are inferior. Thomas absorbed this information, understanding that he was being given insight into experiences that most white settlers never bothered to learn about, glimpses of the human cost of policies that newspapers discuss in abstract terms without acknowledging the lives they destroyed. "Do you miss it?" "The learning, every day," Ayanna admitted. "But I learned that knowledge doesn't disappear just because the schools are closed. It lives in the people who carry it, gets passed along in conversations like this one, survives in places where it can do the most good." "You could teach," Thomas suggested. "There are children in Cedar Ridge who benefit from someone who understands that education is about more than just memorizing facts." "Scarred Apache women don't teach white children," Ayanna said with a flat certainty of someone who'd learned exactly where the boundaries of social acceptance were drawn. "And white parents don't trust people like me with their children's minds." "Maybe white parents need to learn better judgment," Thomas replied. "And maybe the right recommendation from the right person could change some minds about what qualifications matter most." Ayana looked at him with surprise that gradually transformed into something that might have been hope. You would do that? Recommend me to people who might not appreciate your judgment afterward. I'd recommend you to anyone who wanted their children to learn from someone who understands that real education is about teaching people to think, not just telling them what to think. Thomas met her gaze directly. And anyone who doesn't appreciate that kind of judgment probably isn't someone whose opinion I value anyway. That night, as they settled into their separate rooms with a comfortable routine that had developed over weeks of careful cohabitation, Thomas found himself thinking about possibility and the strange ways that practical arrangements could evolve into something approaching partnership. Ayana had brought more to his household than domestic competence. She'd brought intelligence, wisdom, and perspectives that challenged him to see familiar things through different eyes. In her room, Ayana sat by the window, thinking about the conversation they'd shared, about the way Thomas looked at her not as damaged goods to be pitted, but as someone whose thoughts and opinions carried weight worth considering. It was a kind of respect she'd almost forgotten existed. The recognition that her scars might mark her as different, but didn't diminish her value as a person capable of contributing something meaningful to the world. For the first time since the fire that had changed everything, Ayana allowed herself to believe that her future might hold possibilities beyond simple survival. Not love, that remained too dangerous to hope for, but something almost as valuable. The chance to be seen and valued for who she was rather than dismissed for what had been done to her. Summer brought its own revelations to the ranch, arriving with a kind of heat that made the high country shimmer like water and sent sensible people seeking shade during the brutal hours between noon and evening. But it also brought visitors, neighbors who'd heard about Thomas's marriage and felt obligated to pay their respects, traveling merchants who needed water and supplies, occasionally even territorial officials whose duties brought them through the area. Each encounter tested the boundaries of acceptance that Thomas and Ayana had carefully constructed around their unusual household. Some visitors treated Ayana with the careful courtesy due to a white man's wife, regardless of their personal feelings about interracial marriage. Others made their disapproval clear through pointed silences and questions that weren't really questions at all. "Interesting choice, Thomas," said Pete Morrison, a neighboring rancher who'd stopped to discuss water rights but seemed more interested in examining Ayana with the kind of attention usually reserved for livestock being evaluated for purchase. "Can't say I understand it, but I suppose a man gets lonely enough, he'll make accommodations." Thomas felt his jaw clench with the effort of controlling his temper, but before he could respond, Ayana appeared on the porch carrying a tray of coffee and fresh bread that filled the air with scents that made Morrison's attention shift from critical examination to barely concealed appetite. "Mr. Morrison," Ayana said with perfect courtesy, offering refreshment with a kind of gracious hospitality that made refusing seem churlish. "Thomas tells me you've had trouble with your well running dry. I know something about finding water in difficult places, if you'd like suggestions." What followed was a conversation that demonstrated exactly why Thomas's judgment had been better than Morrison's prejudices. Ayana's knowledge of underground water sources, gained from years of living in country where finding water could mean the difference between life and death, proved more valuable than anything Morrison had learned from expensive consultants brought in from Denver. "How'd you know about the spring that feeds from the North Slope?" Morrison asked, his earlier condescension replaced by grudging respect as Ayana sketched a map that would save him thousands of dollars in drilling costs. "Water follows patterns that don't change just because men draw different boundaries on paper," Ayana replied. "My people understood this land before yours arrived, and understanding doesn't disappear just because the people who held it are forced to live somewhere else." Morrison left with information that would solve his water problems and a different perspective on the woman he'd initially dismissed as Thomas's desperate accommodation to loneliness. More importantly, word began to spread to the community that Thomas Whitmore's Apache wife was someone worth listening to, someone whose knowledge could be valuable to people smart enough to overlook their prejudices. "You handle that well," Thomas said after Morrison's departure, noting how Ayana had managed to educate without condescending, to assert her competence without making their visitor feel diminished. "My grandmother taught me that the best way to change people's minds is to make them grateful for your help," Ayana replied. Hard to hate someone whose advice just saved you money and labor. But it was the evening visits that revealed the deeper changes taking place in both Thomas and Ayana. When they were alone together, when the need to present a united front to skeptical outsiders gave way to genuine conversation. Something had begun to develop that went beyond mere companionship or practical cooperation. "Read to me," Ayanna requested one evening as they settled on the porch to watch stars emerge in the darkening sky. "It's been so long since I heard someone read aloud, and your voice makes even familiar words sound new." Thomas selected a book of poetry that Mary had loved, opening the verses that spoke of love and loss and the strange persistence of hope in the face of circumstances that seemed designed to crush optimism. As he read, he became aware of Ayanna's attention in ways that made familiar words carry new meaning, made him conscious of the rhythm and music of language in ways he'd forgotten since Mary's death. "Do you have favorites?" Thomas asked when he'd finished the evening selection. "I used to memorize poems when I was in school," Ayanna admitted. "Kept them in my head like treasures that couldn't be taken away no matter what else was lost." "Recite one," Thomas suggested, settling back in his chair with the contentment of someone who discovered that sharing intellectual pleasures could be as intimate as any physical connection. What followed was a recitation that revealed layers of Ayanna's education and sensitivity that daily conversation had only hinted at. Her voice, trained in the cadences of two very different oral traditions, gave familiar verses new life, made Thomas hear beauty and meaning that he'd missed in previous readings. "Where did you learn to do that?" Thomas asked when she'd finished, genuinely amazed by her ability to transform written words into something approaching music. "From listening to my grandmother tell the old stories, and from teachers who understood that poetry was meant to be spoken aloud rather than just read silently," Ayanna replied. "Good poetry sounds different when it's shared with someone who appreciates the music as much as the meaning." As summer progressed and their evening conversations grew longer and more personal, Thomas found himself looking at Ayanna with new eyes, not just seeing past her scars, the intelligence and strength beneath, but beginning to understand that her scars were part of what made her beautiful, evidence of survival, markers of a spirit that had endured trauma without being destroyed by it. "You know," Thomas said one evening as they walked the fence line together, checking for damage from the afternoon storm, "when I first saw you, I thought I was seeing someone who needed rescuing. And now," Ayanna asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected his answer, "now I think you're the one who's been doing the rescuing," Thomas admitted. "This house, this life, me, we were all just existing before you arrived. You made us remember what it felt like to be alive." Ayanna stopped walking, turning to face him in the golden light of sunset that painted her scars in shades that made them look like decorations rather than disfigurements. "Thomas," she said quietly, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere along the way, this arrangement stopped being just practical and started being something I can't imagine living without," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the careful honesty of someone who'd learned that some truths were too important to leave unspoken. "I'm saying that if you're willing, I'd like this marriage to become real in all the ways that matter." Ayanna studied his face in the fading light, searching for signs of pity or obligation, or the kind of desperation that might make a man convince himself he felt something he didn't. Whatever she saw in his weathered features seemed to satisfy whatever test she was conducting, because slowly, carefully, she reached out to touch his cheek with fingers that trembled slightly. "I stopped thinking of this as temporary weeks ago," she admitted, "but I was afraid that if I let myself hope for more, I'd lose what we'd already built." "Then let's build something new," Thomas said, covering her hand with his own. "Something that belongs to both of us. Something that acknowledges what we both learned about the difference between surface beauty and the kind that goes all the way through." Their wedding night, when it finally came, happened not on the anniversary of their legal ceremony, but on a warm August evening, when conversation had given way to comfortable silence, and silence had somehow transformed into acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing quietly for months. There were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, just Thomas taking Ayanna's hand as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge, and her decision not to pull away. "Are you certain?" Thomas asked as they stood together in the doorway between the main house and the room that had been hers since their marriage began. "I've been certain for weeks," Ayanna replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to trust her own judgment about what was worth risking. The question is whether you're ready to see all of me, including the parts that aren't beautiful by anyone's definition. I've been seeing all of you since the day we met, Thomas said gently. The question is whether you're ready to believe that what I see is beautiful by the only definition that matters. What followed was a wedding night that bore no resemblance to the desperate coupling that Thomas had shared with Mary in their youth, or the careful politeness that had marked the early weeks of his marriage to Ayanna. Instead, it was a revelation of how physical intimacy could be transformed when it grew from genuine respect and understanding rather than obligation or mere desire. Ayanna's scars, which he'd expected would be sources of shame or disgust, became under Thomas's gentle exploration something approaching artwork, evidence of survival that he traced with fingers that communicated reverence rather than pity. The fire that had marked her had also strengthened her, had created someone whose beauty came not from perfection, but from the courage to remain open to love despite having every reason to protect herself from further harm. "You're magnificent," Thomas whispered as moonlight painted patterns across skin that told stories of loss and endurance and ultimate triumph over circumstances that had tried to break what couldn't be broken. "I'm scarred," Ayanna corrected, but without the defensive edge that had marked such acknowledgments in the past. "You're both," Thomas replied. "And that's what makes you beautiful in ways that untested beauty never could be." The months that followed their true wedding night brought changes that transformed not just their marriage, but their place in the community around them. Word had spread about Ayanna's knowledge of water sources, plant medicine, and the kind of practical wisdom that proved valuable to people struggling to make lives in harsh country. Visitors came seeking advice about everything from sick livestock to failed crops, and gradually, grudgingly, the community began to accept that Thomas Whitmore's scarred Apache wife was someone worth consulting rather than merely tollating. "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you consider teaching her daughter to read," Thomas announced one evening as they shared supper prepared from vegetables grown in Ayanna's expanding garden. "Says the girl's too smart for school in Cedar Ridge, but too young to send away to Denver. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband called me a red-skinned freak last spring?" Ayanna asked with the kind of irony that came from someone who'd learned to find humor in human inconsistency. "The same Mrs. Patterson who now tells everyone that my wife knows more about healing plants than the territorial doctor," Thomas confirmed. Amazing how people's attitudes change when their children's futures are at stake. Ayanna considered the request, understanding that accepting would mark another step in her integration into a community that had initially seen her as Thomas's inexplicable burden. "Tell her yes," she said finally. "But tell her also that I'll be teaching the girl to think for herself, not just to repeat what she's been told." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Thomas replied, reaching across the table to take her hand in a gesture that had become natural rather than self-conscious. "World needs more people who know how to think, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." That evening, as they walked the fence line that had become their favorite place for private conversation, Thomas found himself thinking about transformation and the strange paths that led people from one kind of life to another. A year ago, he'd been a man slowly dying of loneliness on an isolated ranch where silence had become his only companion. Now he was half of a partnership that had enriched not just his own life, but the lives of people around them. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayanna asked, following his gaze toward the lights of Cedar Ridge that twinkled in the distance like fallen stars. "Marrying someone who made your life more complicated than it had to be?" "Every day," Thomas replied, then smiled at her startled expression. "I regret that it took me 3 years of pointless solitude to figure out that complicated was exactly what I needed. I regret that you had to go through so much pain before finding your way to my fence line. I regret that we wasted so many weeks being careful when we could have been building something real from the beginning. And the scars," Ayanna asked, touching her face with the unconscious gesture that still marked moments of vulnerability. "Do you regret that your wife's face makes people stare and whisper?" Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight that made her scars look like silver decorations against skin that glowed with health and happiness that hadn't been there when he'd first found her standing in shadows. "I regret that you still think of them as flaws instead of recognizing them for what they are, which is proof that you're strong enough to survive anything, beautiful enough to make a lonely man remember what love feels like, and brave enough to risk your heart on someone who'd forgotten how to deserve it." Thomas cupped her face in his hands, running his thumbs along the lines that marked her passage through fire. These scars didn't make you less beautiful, Ayana. They made you real in ways that perfect beauty never could be. As they walked back toward the house that had become home for both of them, Thomas reflected on the lessons that a scarred Apache woman had taught him about beauty and strength and the difference between loving someone for their perfection and loving them for their courage to be imperfect and still worthy of devotion. The ranch that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with the music of shared life. Conversations that lasted long into the night. Laughter that came more easily than either had expected. The comfortable silences that marked relationships where two people had learned to be themselves without fear of judgment or rejection. True beauty, Thomas had discovered, sometimes came with scars. But those scars, when they belonged to someone brave enough to trust again after being broken, could be more beautiful than any unmarked perfection the world had to offer. And in a house where love had learned to grow in the spaces between what was lost and what was found, that was exactly the kind of beauty that lasted long enough to build a life on.